From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast, with workplace mental health becoming a priority for businesses who want to retain staff and prevent burnout. This is the source of information for creating sustainable and psychologically healthy workplaces in Canada.
Hello, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety podcast. I'm your host, Marianne Dayton. The aim of these podcast series that happen in Singapore, Australia, and here in Canada is to share practical strategies on how to protect psychological health and safety in the workplace. Each week, we'll have interesting guests from across Canada and around the world who share tips and strategies for those who want to make a positive difference in their workplaces. My guest for today is Françoise Mathieu. And Françoise is a very fascinating person. She is a registered psychotherapist. She is an expert in compassion fatigue. She is somebody that I've gone to learn more about dealing with burnout and helping people to manage workplaces that are very demanding, like those in healthcare. She's a sought-after keynote speaker, and she's the executive director of Tend Academy. Welcome to Françoise. So great to have you here. I want to get you right off the hop to explain to people who might not know the term what compassion fatigue is.
Sure. So the term compassion fatigue is really the notion of that profound emotional and physical exhaustion that we can develop both in our personal lives and in our work lives. In our personal lives, when we are in a prolonged caregiver role of some capacity. And in our professional lives, obviously, there's so many high-touch professions where we notice a shift in our energy and our tolerance for other people's either pain, suffering, or their complex needs. And we kind of sense that real transformation within ourselves where we just don't have what we used to have to offer them.
So how do you distinguish compassion fatigue from burnout?
It's one of my favorite questions ever. I actually just had a very lovely, not a fight, I had a very respectful dialogue with a physician about this morning. Burnout originally, as you know, came out of really two separate psychologists, really in the late 70s, early 80s, who were exploring that notion of kind of exhaustion, but also depersonalization. And it was really at the beginning exploring mental health professionals and how their working conditions was leading to this shift in functioning. That was a long time ago. What we now know is that burnout, number one, can happen to anyone in any profession. It is not specific to the helping professions. And burnout really has to do with your working conditions. And what I mean by that is your hours, your pay, your rewards, your recognition, who you immediately report to, perceptions of fairness, which of course are so amplified in these pandemic times. So burnout really has to do with your experiences of work, whereas compassion fatigue really has to do with an emotional transformation. And so the way I think about them is, of course, there's overlap, and we kind of use that Venn diagram analogy. So you could definitely have overlap between the two, but they are really quite distinct in my opinion.
Yeah. Do you know what's interesting is it was listening to you speak when I first understood that there was a time in my life that I experienced burnout. I didn't have a name for it. I just knew that I was going through the motions for about 3 months and no energy. And then I heard you speak about compassion fatigue. I heard you talk about burnout, and it was like a light bulb went on, and I was, oh, that's what that was. So
sorry, I'm terrible at podcasts. Can I interrupt? But there's in the literature, sometimes people say you have to name it to tame it, and so finally you recognize it. But the added distinction I want to make is that you could develop burnout from a job that has absolutely nothing to do with being person or client facing. I don't know about any of your listeners, but I'm sure many of us did profoundly unrewarding, dangerous, or boring jobs back in the day. Many of us put ourselves through high school or college by doing those types of jobs. Maybe we're being harassed. I had an 11-hour a day job that was the most mind-numbingly boring thing. I could absolutely develop burnout there, but it had nothing to do with other human beings or being in a caregiver role whatsoever.
Yeah, burnout. Whereas compassion fatigue is directly tied to caregiving roles.
Correct.
Right. And so, Françoise, let's connect the dots for people who are listening. How do you see the connection between compassion fatigue and psychological health and safety?
How much time have we got? How do we?
you just go.
Okay. So what's been so interesting, I mean, I've been doing this for 2 decades now, and there is an increased awareness of the contributing factors. And I think I often get asked a little bit about chicken and egg, and I don't think it necessarily lives in a linear kind of way. We know, for example, that the third term that we haven't mentioned yet is this notion of secondary or vicarious traumatization. So people who are deeply impacted, sometimes traumatized by exposure to trauma stories in their work, that has a more linear path. So the literature have found that, you can have what we call sentinel events, and over time, if they're not addressed, they can lead, for example, to PTSD. So that's more of a continuum. There isn't necessarily a continuum with compassion fatigue, burnout, and psychological health and safety. However, what the literature says, and before I add that, there are lots of gaps in the research. I just finished a 50-hour literature review, which was super fun for a nerd like me, but there are a lot of gaps in the research still. But we know that there are certain elements that can be protective. So, and as I'm sure you know, pay, people's salaries, I mean, most people want to be paid appropriately and paid enough to have a good life, but it's not a big factor. The factors that have much more impact is your social support at work. Do you trust your boss? Is your boss flexible, and fair? Are you able to go to someone if your workload is unmanageable and have a conversation with them about that? The other one that's a really big one, we call confidence and competence. And I'm thinking right now, for example, many of us are hearing about what's called the Great Resignation, which we're seeing, right? And one of the things that the Great Resignation is doing, of course, is not only creating an increase in workload because there are less people to do the work, but it's also creating expertise gaps. And so can I give you a concrete example? So
Absolutely.
I have a friend who's in law enforcement, and he's totally fine with me sharing this story. He knows how to laugh at himself, but I have watched his very rapid progression in his career, so I keep looking at his job title on LinkedIn, and he was going from, detective to inspector to superintendent, which in law enforcement is very high. And it was so rapid. I finally reached out to him and said, like, what is going on? Like, I know you're good, but come on. And he's like, no, you're right. He said, so many people retired that there was this huge void, this huge gap. And so I was very rapidly promoted. And what that does for someone like him or in any other profession is all of a sudden he does not have the years of experience learning how to be a good leader, right? He's kind of thrown in at the deep end of the pool. And he may not have at this time the confidence and competence. He'll get it eventually, but people will need to be given time. And finally, just good quality working conditions in terms of mentorship, whether that's formal or informal.
Yeah, and every one of those things that you mentioned can be tied directly to psychosocial factors, right? Whether it's clear leadership and expectations, it's involvement or influence, it's civility and respect, all of those things that you mentioned tie directly to the psychosocial factors. And I was just talking to somebody who said, that psychological health and safety comes down to how do you feel when you're at work. And that's compassion fatigue. And those factors that you talked about are all ones that will make you feel and think a certain way. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. And when you're looking at a workplace that's ripe with compassion fatigue, they say people are dropping like flies. What's your advice to the employer on how they can begin to turn that around?
So we're dealing with a lot of workplaces right now. It was something we were dealing with prior to the pandemic, but it's definitely amplified at this time. I should say before I go on that we're very fortunate because only wonderful organizations who may be in trouble, but only wonderful organizations go to us, because really problematic organizations who don't have leadership buy-in, they don't even think of going to us. They use other metrics or performance indicators, right? So that's my caveat. The thing that organizations need to acknowledge is that, my dear colleague, Dr. Pat Fisher, always said, leaders are people too, and they are often the most stressed out members of organizations. So what I always recommend when we are contacted by an organization, my first question is always, who's getting in touch and what was the reason for getting in touch with us? So sometimes it's grassroots, right? So sometimes it's someone really from rank and file who are saying, we really need this. And my question then is, do you have the champions? Do you have buy-in? Do you have support? Or are you a one person, person trying to change everything from the bottom, which happens. Sometimes there has been a trigger. So, we've been contacted because there was a tragedy in the workplace, an inquest, a lawsuit, a labor dispute, some crisis. And I always want to know about that, because that's a little bit different. My entry point and my method is going to be different. And then there are times where people say, listen, we are receiving a giant volume of requests. If we did a big survey and everyone wants us to be able to address this, or this was really named as our number one contributing factor. And then the final one would have to do with, I'm trying to be very inclusive about different workplaces here, but I guess I would call them customer complaints, depending on the field you're in, where organizations would say, we're really having high conflict. Actually, I'll give you an example. We were contacted last year by a large Fortune 500 company in the United States. And with everything that was going on in the US, a lot of, we all know what was going on, but protests and very amplified people, feelings from citizens. Their call center operators were receiving a very large volume of abusive phone calls. And this workplace, which I would say is a very progressive, thoughtful workplace, said, we want to support our frontline folks, not only to have zero tolerance to abuse, but this is a financial institution. So you can imagine that they're receiving calls from people who are facing financial loss, job loss. They're not calling on their best day. And what these call center operators were saying is, these people's demands and needs are way outside the scope of what I can even offer them. And so they were experiencing significant emotional distress, and at times a loss of empathy or compassion, because it's like, maybe the first 2 callers, you've got empathy. And after that, what if you have 5,000 callers? And what's that like for you? What's that experience like? So that's a giant answer, but
it is, but it just brings up another concept, which is the idea of how we prepare people for the roles that they take. Mm-hmm. And do we say, these are the types of calls you're going to get, and these are the range of reactions that you might have. And this is how the successful, experienced people put that in perspective. And I think often we'll say the first one, oh, you're going to get calls from angry people and upset people, and you don't have to tolerate it and whatever. But we forget to tell them about the emotions that can come up for them. And we forget to share how to manage it. And I think it's a flaw that we have in our onboarding, our orientation, and our training. But you have a podcast yourself, Françoise, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what it is and some of the things that you have taken away from the guests that you've had on that podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's actually, we're having our 1-year anniversary, and it's called Psychological PPE. And it was really designed to provide micro strategies for folks. And I'll give you a concrete example in a minute. You just inspired me to think of someone who's a 911 communicator who talked about all the things you just mentioned. So the Psychological PPE is aimed to really provide a theme every month. We've talked about boundaries, setting limits, imposter syndrome, different ways to refuel. It's very general in the sense that I think anyone listening who's in the world of work could relate to these elements. But we're really focusing also on the neuroscience of resetting ourselves. And so let me give you my 911 communicator example. So number one, 911 communicators, as everyone know, well, in my opinion, are absolutely first responders, but they have to deal with extremely intense and high volume calls. And one of the challenges is that role modeling can be problematic if you are being mentored by really cynical, pretty crunchy, crispy, older communicator who's been there for too long and who maybe themselves have lost compassion. So role modeling is only good if they can still have the empathy to understand that as a rookie, you might actually have a very strong emotional reaction to something, right? So you don't want the mentor to be like, you'll get over that, or that's no big deal when you're experiencing it. So the micro strategies that we're offering in the psychological PPE, we had a 911 communicator who said to us, I'm using these every single day. They are micro movements. I'm talking 10 seconds, 3 minutes. These are things that people can do before, during, and after work. And Marianne, what I started getting concerned about, as you know, I wrote a paper about this in 2015 called Beyond Kale and Pedicures. I believe in self-care, like I do it all the time. But I became really worried that we were starting to do a lot of spray and pray at people, kind of like, wellness will fix everything. And here's our exercise room. Pre-pandemic, we have a workout room in our hospital. And I'd be like, does anyone ever use it? And they're like, no, but it's there, And I wanted to look at what is it that really does make a difference. And what the research has shown, here's how I say it colloquially. I don't really care what anyone does on a Friday night. Like, you want to watch 7 hours of Netflix, knock yourself out. You want to watch 2 hours of TikTok, like what you do Friday night is the least interesting part of your well-being. It's fine, whatever, as long as it's, not too destructive. What really does make a difference, and we talk about in psychological PPE, is your daily rituals, however small they may be. And that's about how you arrive at work in real life or virtual, how you transition at the end of your day. We see so many people right now working remotely where they're never done. Their laptop's still going on the side of the dining room table. What are ways to reset after a challenging interaction? Let's say if you work with customers. And those are all the things that we talk about, really small micro strategies.
Yeah, and I think those are the practical, important things that we can share. So let me ask you, Françoise, what are your micro strategy routines that keep you being able to do all the great work you do?
So I have to disclose that I'm pretty rigorous about this. And I have friends who sometimes complain. They say my boundaries are too healthy. So when people listen to this, I don't, so that's my first disclaimer. I take really good care of myself, and I'll explain why in a minute, why I had to start doing that. And my second disclosure is that I am an empty nester. So there are things that I get to do that I did not used to get to do when I was a full-time parent and a caregiver. So that's my other caveat. So I learned a long time ago, I've been in this field for over 25 years. I learned a long time ago that I tend to work too much. I get very engaged in what I do. And I wasn't necessarily good about leaving work behind. And I also know that I'm someone who I've had generalized anxiety disorder since I was a kid. And it's very well managed through exercise. So those are my two challenges, right? Tendency to overwork and anxiety. So what I learned very early on is that I personally need to exercise 4 times a week. I don't necessarily even feel like it. I don't really love it. It's not like, woohoo, but it totally resets my whole neurochemistry. So one thing I do is I exercise 4 times a week. It doesn't have to be long. It might be, a walk outside, a vigorous walk, like those. That's really, I protect that very much. I really make sure to look at my social media consumption. That's where I got a lot of flack a few years ago, Marianne. I deleted my Facebook account and I got so much flack from my family. They're like, how are we going to know what you're doing? And I'm like, well, who cares? Like, it's not that interesting. You can email me, what have you. So I'm really, really careful about my social media consumption. I find that it has an impact on my mood. I protect my sleep. I don't need a lot of sleep, but I need good quality sleep. So I'm very rigorous about that. And the final one is I really look at what I consume in terms of media or books or television, what have you. I really look and see how it makes me feel. And a very simple example, which I know we all know it, but we do it anyways, right? I found that if I, go to bed with my iPad and watch a Netflix about a serial killer, I don't have a great sleep. You're like, oh, that's, really magical. But I do a really careful audit, if that makes sense. But it's day to day. It's not a New Year's resolution. It's not something with self-blame. I don't look back and go, what's wrong with you? Like, I really use self-compassion to look at what's ahead. And I kind of do an audit, every Sunday. Sunday's my day to get ready for the week. I always kind of say, hey, what do I need more of? So it's never about deprivation or criticism. It's about what are the small things I can tweak? Because what your listeners, may not know is that I work in a very high trauma exposed field. I mostly work with human trafficking, internet child abuse. Like I do very high trauma work. So it really became important for me to put those in place in order to do that work in a way that was healthy and would protect me.
Yeah, all great ideas. And my hope is that people will listen to that and maybe not do exactly what you're doing, but think, what do I need? And be able to do it. So let's try and extrapolate that idea of micro strategies for your own personal well-being to micro strategies that a team leader might be able to implement into a high stress work team.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing I tell all leaders is you are very powerful role models, and what you do matters a lot more than what you say. And I have seen so many leaders do things like, and again, no judgment here, just open heart, do things like they've decided they're going to work during hours that suit them best, but are probably not office hours. And so they're sending things out of their inbox at 3:00 in the morning, named time sensitive. They don't mean for their teams to respond at that time. Or maybe they're going to send an email as Friday night, let's say they're a 9-to-5 workplace, and they're just clearing their, inbox for the weekend. And they send a junior staff member an email that says, hey, so-and-so, I'd love to meet Monday morning, 9:00. No context, no reassurance. And how many times have I had a staff member say, I spent the entire weekend thinking either I was getting fired or I was in trouble. And the leader was none the wiser. So your daily conduct, first of all, people are watching, right? And I'm not saying that you can never, I sometimes work on weekends. I have a flex schedule. It helps me because I can do deep work. No one's, interrupting me. So I'm not saying that, but just thinking for a minute about the messaging you send. And if you say to people, take care of yourself, but I'm not going to, or I don't need to, or I don't need to go to those sessions that I booked you all for a well-being session, but of course I don't need that. Just thinking about the role modeling. The second one, and it's very salient to my mind because it happened a couple of weeks ago in a certain workplace, is tokenism about well-being. And what I mean by that is not addressing anything about people's workload, but giving everybody a stress ball. Yeah. Like it does not land well. I can assure you.
Yeah, no, I know. It's funny. I love your kale and pedicures because I say eating apples and doing jumping jacks, and it's not it. It is about the way we treat each other, the way we interact. But you and I are both entrepreneurs. And I wonder if we could share a little bit about how we have created our own support system. I've come to you on several occasions for your advice, for some help with things, both personally and professionally, and how people can do that both in the workplace and, if they're like us, where they're self-employed, that they can do it outside.
So first of all, right back at you, you have provided me incredible sources of advice and wisdom and support. And I agree that when we're entrepreneurs, we do need to create those networks on our own. And actually, if we go back in time, Marianne, I used to be a clinician in private practice. So I was working alone again, and I was doing, therapy with clients every day by myself. And again, I needed a community of practice. And so I joined a group of other therapists who were all on their own, and we would meet once a month and have kind of that regular meeting time to just talk about things. But I think in addition to that, we need informal support networks. And the informal ones are ones where we can pick up the phone or call, because the reality is that there's so many times where it's not going to be next week at a certain time that I need to talk to you. It's probably right away. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's going to be time sensitive.
Yeah, that those people that you can call. I remember years ago somebody saying, well, if you want to call somebody a true friend, you'd call them at 2 a.m. and say, can I come and crash on your couch? And you start thinking, how many people would I do that to? Like, not very many. But in the professional support, it's like, could you just say, I just need to chat. Have you got a second? And I know I've got people in my life that I would do that to, maybe less than once every 2 years. But I have no doubt that when I do, they would respond and they would be there for me. So social connection in everything that we look at, and through our experience with the pandemic, seems to be so important. Can you talk about how social connection at work might impact compassion fatigue?
Yeah. So currently, there's so many people who are either working remotely or hybrid. And what's been tough about that is that we don't have that informal, just walked out of my cubicle, hey, do you have a minute debrief, right? We don't have that. The other thing I found, of course, and I'm sure many people who are listening, they've had some new staff on board during the pandemic and they've never met them. We had a joke in my workplace that I have several of my staff I've never met in person. And I joke to them that I'm actually a mermaid. I don't have feet because they have no idea, right? I joked I was 8 feet tall or 2 feet tall. Like we don't have that same, kind of connection. So I think one thing that's really challenging right now with the complex kind of work reality is that either we're on screens so much that I may not want to actually connect with anybody after, Zooming all day, or that we've lost those informal ways of doing it. Again, and I know I may sound like a broken record because I think it really comes down to trust and wisdom and access to people who have that wisdom so that we can bounce ideas off them. And one of the things, we talk so much about trusted elders in our communities, but also in our workplaces. Especially when you're learning, where are the places where you can go and not feel scared of asking questions, not being sure about certain things? If you're in a leadership role, the challenge is sometimes that you don't actually have a community of practice because maybe you're at the top of the heap, so to speak, or maybe there's also a competitive atmosphere where you may not feel necessarily confident or safe going to talk to someone else. Let's say you're both actually, competing for a certain job. So I really encourage everyone to think about, you don't need a dozen trusted advisors, but you need a few, and some of them are best within your workplace and some of them are best outside of your workplace. The other thing about compassion fatigue is that what really helps is being able to bounce off how you're feeling. I have another case example, if you don't mind, that just happened earlier today. We're not always on the same, I think of it as a sort of reservoir, right? That I might feel really drained by a certain case or story. And maybe you actually have a lot of energy for it right now, hopefully, right? Let's pretend we're dealing with particular challenging, chronic, frequent situation. Let's say it's a fellow staff member. And I might just be like, I feel so done right now. Like I have nothing left for that person. But if we can label it, instead of me just, making that person be a problem, that pause where I can go, is that like, are they actually being problematic or is it me? Like, is my reservoir so empty right now. And I might be able to go to you as a colleague and say, look, I'm just really feeling this drain. Are you feeling the same way? Or have you got a little bit more of a reservoir right now to go and support, perhaps someone who's going through a really tough time? And I mean, I've learned this from you, the odds of a person having productivity issues, attendance issues, anything related to work, the odds of that person struggling with some type of emotional or psychological problem is what percentage? 100%, 99%? It's extremely high.
Yeah. And sometimes it's like you said, chicken and egg. Sometimes they have these emotional issues because they're struggling at work. And sometimes they're struggling at work because they have emotional issues, but nobody wants to fail at work. Nobody wants to feel incompetent. And so it does really become intertwined. And I know the folks that I've spoken to who ended up with compassion fatigue often describe times where they felt they weren't doing it well enough, they weren't doing it right, that with their best effort, something failed, somebody died, something went wrong. And that's a tough thing to live with, and it is energy depleting. So the question is, how could we encourage this kind of open dialogue, social support that people really need?
So I was referring to Dr. Pat Fisher earlier, and as you know, but she recently retired, but she was my co-executive director and really my mentor in terms of organizational health. And what Pat recommended is creating communities of practice, which may actually absolutely be within a team. But she really recommended a structure around it so that, number one, it wasn't a free-for-all, because we all know, I'm sure many of us have been at these meetings, there's always one particularly talkative person. They often monopolize the whole meeting, and it can be frustrating. So she recommended having 3 different items to the agenda. And the items will depend on the type of work you do, but I'll use the type of work I do as an example. Number one is she encouraged us to have a time limited period to talk about sentinel events or debrief something that's particularly critical, right? Most really traumatic things would probably have been discussed some other time because these are more regular communities of practice meeting, but being able to debrief or process something so we can take the temperature down and bring ourselves back in the room. The second one is she talks about being able to have a real peer consultation. So here are the challenges with this particular file, case, what have you. What do you all recommend? Kind of having that consultation. The third part, which I think a lot of times we forget, is what expertise and training is missing in this room right now. That's not a criticism. We can't be all things. We can't be experts in everything, but highlighting, I think we're missing something here. We're missing an expert advice. We're missing some type of training or consultation. What is the action item so that we can go out there and get the tools that we are lacking? And again, that goes back to people feeling like they can really do the job, but that they also have the tools. However, and I'm going to throw this in, Marianne, because I know you're hearing this all the time. What people are telling me right now is we don't have time for any of that.
No.
There is no time. I hear that every day. No time.
Yeah. But just a little conversation when something goes wrong to say, what did we learn? What will we do different next time? Can change something from a shame and blame kind of situation to, someone said to me recently, you don't bounce back after a trauma. You have to bounce forward because you can't go back to where you were. You're not the same person before that happened to you. And so it's, how can we learn? How can we grow so that we can move forward from this? Mm-hmm. And that doesn't have to be a 2-day training course. That can be a small conversation that is regularly held every time something doesn't go well. And really, every time something does go well, because sometimes it's like, wow, that was really easy. Why was it easy? Like, what did we do? And maybe we can actually make it easy again the next time.
I want to add to something you just said about bouncing back. Really agree with that. We were recently teaching a course on post-traumatic growth. that people who are not familiar with it, it really refers to certain individuals after a traumatic event or a series of events somehow seem to have transformed in becoming human beings that have a greater wisdom or appreciation of life. The example is often, of course, someone like Nelson Mandela. How was that man? How did he become the person he was? 27 years of incarceration, coming out with such grace, so on and so forth. The problem with post-traumatic growth is that there's often a value attributed to it that somehow, I always fight against this saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. No, it doesn't. It's ridiculous. Like,
not
no
always. No, sometimes
Not
makes you
always.
much weaker. Right.
And the second piece is also, it is not a badge of honor, right? Like, trauma is bad. Let's just agree. Trauma is bad, nor do we ever wish for anyone to experience it. And trauma or adversity does not always lead to enlightenment. So here's the thing. The thing that, and this comes from my colleague, Diana Tickes, we talk about this all the time. What she suggests is that we don't give ourselves, and I think this is societal and cultural, we don't give ourselves enough time to just sit. So I'll give you the image that she shares. So I'm sure many listeners are familiar with Calvin and Hobbes, the cartoon. And this is a cartoon where Calvin trips on a rock and falls on his tushy. And then he bounces back and he's like, ta-da, bigger, stronger, all of that. And Diana always says what's missing from that comic strip is, between frame 3 of hitting his butt and, bouncing back, we're missing the slides, that belong there. And they are about sitting with the pain. They are about having time to process. And she says what happens a lot in our cultures and our workplaces is, she calls it the false ta-da. And the false ta-da is people going, I'm fine. But you're not, or you haven't even had a chance to be fine. But that happens a lot, right? Where it's a little bit like, perhaps outside the scope of our conversation today, but, the discomfort around grief, right? That we somehow are so uncomfortable around other people's grief that we somehow just want them to be fine again. Like, oh, you were on leave for 3 days, I hope you're okay, but let's not talk about this ever again. So does that make sense?
Yeah, grief is something that I've been working on lately. And the fortunate thing for me is that I have a sister-in-law who's a grief counselor. Mm-hmm. And so when I had a significant loss, all of the things like loss of compassion for other people, I mean, who would think that would happen to me? The brain fog, the lack of focus, the sort of feeling like you're in slow motion, the forgetting to eat, forgetting to drink, all of those things. I ended up being rather amused because it happened to me and I thought, oh, that's what she was talking about. But because I was amused and aware, mm-hmm. I didn't beat myself up, which is exactly what I would have done otherwise. It's like, come on, get over this. You got to keep moving. You got to go on, be strong, you got to. And I didn't. I just thought, okay, I'm just going to ride these waves rather than tread water. And it made the entire experience one of celebrating the love I had for the person I lost, rather than one of just overwhelming despair. And but it's exactly what you said. I sat with it. I didn't ta-da, right?
No. And, my friend Laura van den Lipsky, who, as you know, wrote 2 wonderful books. One of them that I think is really relevant for everyone listening is called The Age of Overwhelm. And it's such a good book because it's short and it's all about micro strategies to reset ourselves. But Laura has a great saying, and she calls it check me out. And it's about self-observation, right? Check me out. And not unlike you, it wasn't a grief experience, but my family experienced a traumatic event 3 years ago. Luckily, everyone ended up being safe, but it was a terrible, tragic event that happened. My son was a witness to a terrible crime. And I was so self-aware. I had the same process where I was like, look at me case managing the heck out of this trauma, right? I was like, that's interesting, because I went to shutdown mode because I'm a crisis person, right? So instead of just feeling what I think most parents would experience in that moment, I case managed it. But I had that meta awareness of like, that is interesting. Like I was watching myself case manage my son's trauma to his great irritation as an aside, because he was like, what are you doing? I practically had my clipboard but it was a sense of control. It was a sense of trying to control an uncontrollable situation. And when finally I was able to just experience whatever I felt, that was interesting too. I agree with you. I had a bit of that scientist of like, this is an interesting reaction to a trauma. And finally, I felt the things I needed to feel. But if we want to finish the post-traumatic growth piece, I don't necessarily think that I have experienced post-traumatic growth as a result of that traumatic event. Like, so when I was studying post-traumatic growth, I was like, I don't think I'm a stronger or better person as a result of that. I'm well, and he's well, thank goodness. But it's not always a gift. Sometimes it's just terrible. And that's okay to just say, this is a tragic event. Like we're allowed to have those,
Right, that they are traumatic. But on the other hand, the fact that you were aware of how you were managing it, of the fact that you can look back and go, it was a terrible tragedy. Fortunately, everybody's all right, that you can look back. I think even those, even though they're not big ta-das, as you would say, are ways to put it in perspective and not still be living there. 100%. So when I think of post-traumatic growth, I don't think of the big transformative person. I just think that I can be objective and I can put the trauma in the rearview mirror rather than living in it, because I'm avoiding the emotions, because they just chase you, right? They're just there all the time if you don't sit with them and experience them.
Well, I'm glad you're raising avoidance, because I've been thinking a lot about that. People who are familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder know this, right? That avoidance is the number one negative kind of marker of people really having a problematic, post-trauma reaction. And I always talk about avoiding avoidance. And if we want to go back to workplace on a much smaller scale, one of the things that I'm sure you see, but I see, is workplace cynicism and sarcasm, to me, is a form of avoidance, right? So if you're going to be cynical, and I mean, how many workplaces do you go into where there's some folks who are just really entrenched in that sense of negativity, but not constructive advocacy? I think every listener knows the difference between advocating for change and being entrenched in a really cynical, negative kind of space. And I see that as a form of avoidance too, actually.
I see that as a form of passive aggressiveness as well, where you can be cynical, you can be sabotaging, you can have negative thoughts, but you never actually state what should be different. You never actually state what is wrong. You're just always being in that space. And that particular approach was a huge trigger for me. And now I will say to somebody who is cynical, who is like that, play devil's advocate for me. What am I missing here? What could we be doing differently? Because I know that cynicism is born of fear that things aren't going to get better, fear that their ideas are going to be rejected, fear that they're going to be dismissed or humiliated. And I try to go right to that and draw them out. So let's have a productive talk about where your cynicisms come from. I don't say it that way, but that's the point.
I was just reading a wonderful book, actually. It's probably the book that I've enjoyed the most this fall. Let me back up and explain a bit. I was working with a lot of very high conflict work environments. Let's just say, where there were a lot of protesters and there were a lot of people with strong emotions around different mandates and rules. Let's just be vague enough in that way, but I think we all know what I'm talking about.
You're protecting privacy. Very good.
Yeah. But I think we can all fill in the blank and think what that's like. And part of it is, how do we deal with extremely dysregulated citizens? Okay. And so this book, and actually, I had it just here, but I put it aside because I'm lending it to a friend. It's called High Conflict by Amanda Ripley. And Amanda Ripley is an investigative journalist. I believe she's won journalism awards. Like she does a deep dive, and she was really interested in entrenched conflicts, like those that never the twain shall meet. And this book is not dense. I read it in a weekend. It like really was like a page turner. And she talks about how to deal with really locked in, entrenched conflict situations. And for lots of reasons, anyone who's listening, who's in a leadership role, I'm recommending it to everyone. But one of her favorite phrases is "tell me more." And "tell me more" is so good because you're not necessarily agreeing or disagreeing with that person. You are just listening. And one of the things that we know, so I love what you just mentioned in terms of anger and fear. What we know is that when people are in anger, first of all, it's way easier to be in anger than in fear. It's just an easier emotion to have. It's often the case, though, of course, that fear is the underlying emotion and anger is that protective one. But what we know, and we don't even need a degree in neuroscience to know this, anger and fear takes us out of our prefrontal cortex, right? And our prefrontal cortex does a lot of things, including impulse control and good decision-making and all of those things. And so what we know is, and when people, we call it flipping your lid, but when people have flipped their lid, so they don't have access to that because anger and fear has triggered them, there's no reasoning that's going to work with them. You know, I'm doing a lot of work with customer service folks right now. So let's say patient experience at a hospital, right? Someone who's answering those calls. You literally, with obviously some caveats, you know, no tolerance for abuse or what have you, but the best thing to do is literally let them vent or let them express themselves without arguing with them, because they don't have access to that functioning. It's a bit, anyone listening, I'm sure you've all had a moment where you said to a friend, "Please, I just need to vent." And have you ever had someone, perhaps, for example, my partner, who likes to problem solve, and instead of letting me vent, he's trying to problem solve, and I'm frustrated because I'm like, just listen. That's kind of what's happening in that moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think that "tell me more" is a really good way to, you are listening. You're not necessarily agreeing or disagreeing. You're just letting people express what's going on. And often that's anger and fear that's coming out.
Yeah. Yeah. I always say that if you disagree, then they'll feel they have to justify and defend their position. So you'll get more negativity. If you agree, they'll feel that you have the same negative thoughts that they do, and you'll get more of the same. So it's only in not agreeing or disagreeing that you can get to solving issues. So that's certainly something that I believe in and reinforce. I know that we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask you something, Françoise, and that is, Dr. Martin Shane gave us a definition of psychological health and safety in the workplace. But what I like to hear is how you explain it in, plain language to somebody who doesn't really understand what it is. How would you explain it?
Not a good soundbite person, so I tend to do more paragraphs than short versions. But okay. So before the pandemic, I traveled extensively, as you did, I'm sure. And I used to actually have to explain what I do for a living to everyone, my Uber driver, all my citizens, the folks at the border. That was always fun. And as an aside, crossing the border has led to more interesting conversations with them, because I would explain to them, they'd say, "I don't understand what you do." And I would say, especially my specialty, I'd say, "I work in high stress, trauma exposed environments. And my specialty is organizational health in high stress, trauma exposed environments." And they would go, "Well, that's me." And I would say, "That is correct." And they would say, "Well, what works? What can I do?" And then I would get the magic bullet request. And I would say, there is no one magic bullet, but the things that make the biggest difference is the opportunity to do an interesting and rewarding job. in a way where you feel safe to grow and to learn and to make mistakes.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's a beautiful way for us to end today. And I'd like to thank you so much and to tell you that the video will be available on the Flourish DX YouTube channel. But then they're going to take short clips of the most brilliant things that you had to say, and they'll be on both the Flourish DX and then my own LinkedIn pages. And just to say to our listeners that if you want to continue this conversation, then you can reach out through LinkedIn and we'll keep going. So Françoise, thank you so much for your time. And thank you so much for always being there for me.
Right back at you. Thanks, Marianne.
Take care.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in North America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.